Vietnam War, Christmas ceasefires, 1968. In December 1968, both North Vietnam and South Vietnam announced an official Christmas ceasefire. Military commands issued orders to temporarily suspend major offensive operations during the holiday period, setting specific time windows for the pause. In several regions, the intensity of fighting dropped noticeably. Airstrikes were halted in designated zones, artillery batteries reduced their fire, and ground units remained in defensive positions rather than advancing. Helicopter activity slowed, and large troop movements were postponed until the ceasefire expired. On the front lines, soldiers experienced an unusual calm. Trenches, fire bases, and jungle positions that were normally under constant threat remained quiet for hours at a time. Units used the pause to rest, clean weapons, repair damaged equipment, and receive supplies without immediate pressure from enemy fire. Wounded soldiers were evacuated, fortifications were reinforced, and communication lines were checked under the temporary suspension of combat operations. Once the Christmas period ended, orders were issued to resume normal military activity, and combat operations restarted across multiple sectors. Lebanese Civil War, Christmas ceasefires, 1975-1976. During the early years of the Lebanese Civil War, fighting regularly paused during the Christmas period in several parts of Beirut and surrounding towns. The conflict had fractured the city into hostile zones divided by barricades, snipers, and militia checkpoints. Around Christmas, multiple factions announced temporary ceasefires. Gunfire decreased across key neighborhoods, artillery bombardments stopped, and roadblocks were partially opened. The pause allowed civilians to cross checkpoints, visit relatives, and gather supplies. Churches held Christmas services without interruption, and aid organizations used the calmer conditions to deliver food and medical assistance. Ambulances moved more freely through contested areas under the temporary suspension of fighting. Armed fighters remained in position, weapons visible, but active engagements were largely avoided during the ceasefire window. After the holiday period passed, checkpoints were reinforced, firing resumed, and the city returned to its divided and fortified state. Northern Ireland, Christmas ceasefires, 1974 and 1994. During the conflict in Northern Ireland, Christmas ceasefires were declared on multiple occasions by paramilitary groups. One of the earliest occurred in December 1974, when armed organizations announced a temporary halt to attacks during the holiday period. During these ceasefires, bombings and shootings decreased significantly. Security forces reported fewer incidents, patrols were reduced in some areas, and checkpoints operated under calmer conditions. A more notable ceasefire took place in December 1994, following a broader political truce earlier that year. Armed groups reaffirmed the pause over Christmas, and violence dropped sharply across Northern Ireland. Police stations, military patrols, and urban centers remained on alert, but attacks were largely absent during the holiday period. The calm allowed families to travel, attend religious services, and gather publicly with fewer restrictions. Public spaces remained monitored, yet the absence of explosions and gunfire marked a clear and observable pause in hostilities throughout the Christmas period. World War I, Western Front Christmas Truce, 1914. In December 1914, only 5 months into World War I, fighting along parts of the Western Front briefly stopped. The war had already settled into trench warfare, with British and German units facing each other across narrow stretches of no man's land in Belgium and northern France. Conditions were harsh, with constant shelling, poor sanitation, and heavy casualties on both sides. On Christmas Eve, some German soldiers placed candles on their trench parapets and began singing carols. In several sectors, British troops responded in kind. What followed was not an ordered ceasefire, but a series of spontaneous, local truces initiated by soldiers without approval from high command. Men cautiously left their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged food, cigarettes, and small gifts, and worked together to recover and bury the dead. Participation varied widely. In some areas, the truce lasted only hours. In others, it continued through Christmas Day. Many sectors saw no truce at all, and fighting continued nearby. Military commanders reacted quickly, issuing strict orders to prevent further fraternization and rotating units to break personal familiarity. By 1915, increased discipline and escalation made a repeat impossible. Korean War, Christmas ceasefire sectors, 1951. By Christmas 1951, the Korean War had settled into a static front near the 38th parallel. United Nations forces and North Korean and Chinese troops faced each other across fortified hills, trenches, and frozen valleys under extreme winter conditions. During the Christmas period, some frontline sectors experienced temporary reductions in fighting. Artillery fire decreased, patrol activity was limited, and both sides avoided major offensives. These pauses were not the result of formal agreements, but practical decisions made by local commanders to manage exhaustion, cold injuries, and logistical strain. Unlike earlier wars, strict discipline prevented open contact between opposing soldiers. There were no meetings in no man's land and no exchanges. The ceasefire existed only as silence, maintained through mutual restraint rather than trust. Within days, normal combat operations resumed. World War II, Italian Front Christmas pause, 1943. By December 1943, Allied and German forces were locked in brutal fighting along the Italian front. The campaign had become a slow advance through mountains, rivers, and fortified villages, with constant artillery fire and high casualties on both sides. In several sectors, especially in quieter mountain positions, fighting slowed during Christmas. These pauses were not officially declared ceasefires, but temporary, local suspensions of fire agreed upon implicitly by frontline units. Soldiers avoided advancing, reduced patrols, and used the time to recover bodies from exposed ground and reinforce damaged positions. Unlike 1914, there was no widespread fraternization. Contact between opposing troops remained limited and cautious. Commanders tolerated these pauses only briefly, viewing them as practical necessities rather than gestures of goodwill. By the days following Christmas, artillery fire and offensive operations resumed across the front. Bosnian War, Christmas ceasefire, 1994. In December 1994, during the Bosnian War, a temporary Christmas ceasefire was agreed upon by several warring factions. The conflict had devastated cities and villages across Bosnia-Herzegovina, with front lines cutting through urban areas and civilian neighborhoods. During the Christmas period, fighting slowed in multiple regions. Artillery fire was suspended in agreed sectors. Sniper activity decreased, and ground units remained in defensive positions. Roads that were normally dangerous opened briefly, allowing limited civilian movement between divided areas. The pause enabled humanitarian activity. Aid convoys delivered food and medical supplies, wounded civilians were evacuated, and repair crews worked on damaged infrastructure under reduced threat of attack. In some cities, religious services were held without interruption for the first time in months. Armed forces remained deployed, observing the ceasefire while maintaining readiness. After the holiday period ended, checkpoints were reinforced, artillery returned to position, and combat operations resumed across the front lines. Nigerian Civil War, Christmas ceasefire, 1967. In December 1967, during the Nigerian Civil War, fighting between Nigerian federal forces and Biafran troops slowed during the Christmas period. Both sides faced heavy casualties and severe humanitarian conditions as the conflict intensified across eastern Nigeria. Around Christmas, limited ceasefires were observed in specific areas. Active combat decreased, artillery fire was reduced, and frontline units avoided major offensives during the holiday. These pauses were not part of a nationwide agreement, but emerged through temporary, localized decisions by commanders. The reduction in fighting allowed humanitarian activity to take place. Aid convoys moved through designated corridors, civilians gathered food and supplies, and medical teams treated wounded soldiers and displaced people under calmer conditions. Military positions remained occupied and troops stayed on alert, but the absence of sustained gunfire marked a clear break from the surrounding weeks of combat. The pause lasted only a short time, and once the Christmas period ended, military operations resumed across the region.